Who was Odin, or Woden, or the one of 50 odd names he had? Leader of the Aesir, chief of the Old Norse gods, a god of poetry, wisdom, death. What do we really know about him? How old is he? Where is he from? What was his original purpose? I'm going to talk about that in this video as part of a number of stories about Odin's origin, and how, in this particular video, how he became chief of the Wild Hunt, how he must be thousands of years old, and how he came to be associated with ravens, wolves and horses, and finally reviewing whether we are correct in assuming that it was he who Tacitus was referring to when he used the term Deus Maximus within his writings. So welcome to the origin of Odin, part 1, the Wild Hunt, and welcome to Cleckenford. So the proto-Indo-Europeans lived in a place we can't exactly pinpoint, and we use language as a way of trying to triangulate this. But words have different strengths at different times in a culture's history, and they can easily be clumped together, leaving any hope of accurate assessment all but lost. And whilst we can try and recreate the language, what the pantheon of the Indo-Europeans actually looked like 8,000 years ago is all but an educated guess. So I'm going to be honest and say there are no firm answers here, but we can infer things, and we can infer things with a reasonable degree of confidence, and I can present you ideas that may be new to you and which have a significant amount of academic support. So most of the ancient gods in the times of the proto-Indo-Europeans were neither human-like nor considered individuals. They could be considered spirits within natural elements of things, often doing harm, spreading diseases or drought, and so they were often referred to in a neutral and plural form, and our ancestors tried to placate them through sacrifice, not out of love but out of fear. Now for Odin, he's first attested to by Tacitus, the Roman historian, who didn't mention him by name but identified him with the term Deus Maximus of the Teutons, and he was compared to the god Mercury. And since Deus Mercury became Woden's day, to us Wednesday, it's hard to argue against the fact that Tacitus was referring to Woden, or as his name would have been pronounced at this time in most of Europe, Wōðanaz. However, Wōdanaz probably had a non-human form around 2,000 years ago, but must have had features to allow Tacitus's informants to apply the Interpretatio Romana to his god. And this Interpretatio Romana is a method of describing something in a way the Romans could compare rather than using the local's name for it. Hence why Tacitus never used the name Woden, and used Deus Maximus, meaning like the major god in effect. Now most other mentions of Woden after this time rely on folklore and myth, and we know from my previous videos how these stories can completely change in a generation or two, let alone 2,000 years. However, there is one piece of folklore that is well known enough with much academic research that may allow us to figure out part of the origin of Odin, and that myth is called the Wild Hunt. Now, even if we can't be 100% sure where the name Wōðanaz originated, the name of the modern wild hunter, which is Wode, goes back to the Indo-European word Wothu, and this word seems to be a noun for describing a collection of spirits, or in this case, sort of wild demonic hunters. And this type of plural word ties in well with how we understand the primitive objects were worshipped in multiples. So whilst we may conclude that Wothu then led to Wōðanaz, how it led to either Othor or Odin is still not very obvious. Now there are many thoughts, and just as an aside here, some believe that Wodan came from Odin through linguistical evolution of dropping a W at the start of a word where it's followed by a vowel, much like the word wolf went to us in Old Norse. Some believe also that the in, which means the in Old Norse, was added to Othor, meaning Odin, in effect taking the word poet and making it the poet. And some believe that the names were the same anyway due to the phonetic connection, while some actually believe that they're not connected at all. And we will look at sort of this part of Odin's name evolution in another video. But for now, what we can be sure of is that Woden's predecessor dates back to before the Indo-European pantheon was created, and was not a human form, and was also not of an individual entity, but a group of horrific wild hunters. And only as time passed, the myths evolved around the wild hunt, did Óðinn become its leader. Now, for those who are familiar with the wild hunt stories, you may well have heard that there are many names said to have led it, from King Arthur to Harlequin, and there are many local variations across the UK and Europe. But probably the oldest of the names we know is Wode, and that too has many variations. And the name can be directly associated with Wode. In effect, while he was associated with a group of Wode, Wode was considered a singular form. So Óþr can be considered as Wode in his northwestern European form, and we know very little of Óþr. He's mentioned a couple of times in the poetic Edda of the Old Norse, and he was known to be Freyja's husband. And then we also have Odin emerging as the leader of the hunt at that sort of point in history where he's using the Edda. And we may consider him the same person now, and they almost certainly grew up independently of each other, and the similarity of their names probably helped merge their attributes together at a later date into the form of one individual, Odin. So let's get back to the hunt and what it really was. It was a procession of the dead speeding through the sky. And that would help strengthen the view that Odin was associated with the death as his primary role long before he's considered a sorcerer. And there's been a lot of academic work on the hunt, and a book by Enter, and here's a book on the wild hunt, talks of different animals being the leader of this wild hunt. Animals including a wolf, a raven, and a horse. And here is another thing that is, this is the really misunderstood thing about the hunt. The leader didn't ride at the front of the procession. They chased it. This devil figure was pursuing the hunt, trying to capture or consume them. They were hunting the procession of the dead. Many stories talk about this spectral huntsman on his horse chasing women or female types, maybe trolls, and it's this connection with Odin on horseback chasing the dead that puts him in the minds of people as Lord of the Dead. And some academics additionally argue that the carrying of a spear helps amplify this role, something that Odin is well known for with Gungnir, the spear that always hits its target. So sometimes in these myths and in European folklore as well, it was the horse that ate people. It was a man-eating horse. That was a common mythology. And it's a connection between Odin as a human and as a anthropomorphic shape, being associated with animals that chase the hunt. In effect, the ravens, the wolves, and the horse. Now, even considering all this, we still can't link the wild hunt with Mercury and Tacitus's observations. However, this is where we should delve into Tacitus's observations a bit more. See, Tacitus's informants may have only reported from a couple of sources of Deus Maximus of the Teutons, and so there may have been many other tribes where the main figure was someone else, Thor or Tyr, for example, elsewhere across Scandinavia and Europe. Although, as mentioned at the start, the naming of Wednesday, Woden's Day, really makes it difficult to assume anything else other than it must have been Woden. And also, between Odin and Mercury, we have lots of commonalities, like they both wore a hat, had a staff, were often travelling, they were writers of poetry, they had the ability to fly, they had much wisdom, and of course, a propensity for deceit. However, we do not know exactly where the reports came from, and the Teutons weren't the only tribes in Europe. There were Celts too, and the Celtic god Lugh, who too was Mercury in Interpretio Romana, and it's worth looking at this just to ensure that Deus Maximus was Woden. You see, because Lugh had similarities in attributes to Mercury, such as with ravens, And if we take a view that whoever was observing the locals from a Roman perspective must have been seeing something obvious to allow them to make that interpretation, it may have been what the god was wearing, it may have been ravens, but we wouldn't have been the stories being told because they wouldn't recall the translations to past the Tacitus, only clear observations. So what we need to understand is that did Wōdanaz of the early millennium have a form that was followed by ravens? And if we know this for sure, then because we know Lug did at this point, then we can sort of start removing the element of doubt that Deus Maximus was Lug, and we can say, yeah, it probably was Woden then. So here we're helped with a dedication or inscription, Mercurio Heranoi, and that's in a place in Germanic territory, written in a Germanic emphasis, not Celtic, and the inscription means to Mercury, raven. And therefore, due to the Germanic bias of the inscription, this can be translated to as Mercury Woden. And so, despite the potential of Tacitus being able to describe the Celtic Lug, we can feel confident that a god called Woden is who he's really attesting to. So it's always good to sort of counteract arguments. Now, there is much more, like I said, about Odin in terms of his origin, as the etymology and myth doesn't mix particularly well, but is interesting to wander through. But I feel in terms of the Wild Hunt, I've probably given you enough information to realise how he was chief, how he was considered the Lord of Death, and how he became associated with the animals in that hunt. And knowing that the hunt is as old as the Proto-Indo-Europeans, that makes that form of God over 8,000 years old. Now, there's more to this story about Odin to tell, and I'll do more videos on this. And we'll look at the creation of his name in future videos, and I'll also put references to the few books I mentioned down below. Please support me in this channel by liking the video and subscribing to it if it's found it interesting and it's helped you, and then also use the notification button to be alerted when new videos come out. So until the next video, please stay safe, stay well, and this was Cleckenfold.